I usually mix those around, but today I felt that releasing a second DOS video in a row would be fine, especially that the games in it are quite curious. So let's not waste any more time and see what's in the store for today. Highlander: The Last of the MacLeods is a third-person view action-adventure game released exclusively for Atari Jaguar. So, why is it in this video at all? Have I finally lost it and started mixing up games and systems? It was bound to happen sooner or later, but I hoped that I had at least a few good years still ahead of me. Oh lord, send me a swift and painless insanity, as I do not want to suffer through seeing my mind go. Not the case here, however, as it seems that the PC version was being developed concurrently to Jaguars, just never saw the light of day. But years later, an alpha version leaked and it is both possible to find online and download to play. So we're lucky, it seems, as we can experience the game that never was, and to be honest, the only difference between this alpha and full Jaguar release is that the story videos are rendered in low resolution and that there's no working option to save the game. So if you want to experience the game in full, you have to complete it in one sitting. In Highlander you play as Quentin MacLeod and you're on the mission to save Clan Dundee from slavers of Cortan, an evil immortal who refused to swear an oath made by all other immortals. That involved no longer killing each other in order to rebuild and guide progress of humanity. So he's like that one friend of yours that always says no when everyone else said yes to whatever the question was, just to spite them. Dick move if you ask me. Whatever. The gameplay is conceptually very similar to Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark games, with full 3D characters and objects displayed on pre-rendered static backgrounds, and it mainly consists of exploration, battles with the enemies, and some simple inventory-based puzzling. The combat is rather clunky, and it's not as straightforward and natural feeling as in the two aforementioned classics, and while you get to find sword rather quickly in the game, seemingly the best weapon, if you ever come across a rubber chicken, don't hesitate to switch to it. And it's not a joke, it's an honest-to-heart advice, as it's easier to hit enemies with it and it does very comparable damage to the sword. In the end, it's not very often we get to check out and play something that should have never existed, so if you're into games that quote-unquote weren't, make sure not to sleep on the Highlander: The Last of the MacLeods. Highway Fighter is a very obscure Russian sharer precursor to a much more well-known Highway Hunter, and also a top-down car-based shooter. As per usual, you're facing an evil world-threatening criminal organization and you're set to destroy it, cause who else would have? And believe it or not, you do it all without ever setting foot on a solid ground. You never leave your car is what I'm saying. You jump in your faithful Betty, cause that's how you named it, don't fact check it, it's definitely in the game's lore. I wouldn't lie to you now, would I? Definitely not today. Anyway, you're speeding across long stretching highways, facing hundreds upon hundreds of various enemy vehicles. Who would have thought that the criminal organization would base their entire operations from within their cars? But they did. The laser cannon that you start with, while being a pretty neat and powerful weapon, can obviously be upgraded by pickups to offer even more destructing power than it normally does. Then there are also shields front, side and rotating that you can find. First will allow you to destroy the enemies in front of you, ramming into them, just the way they do it in action movies. Side will prevent your car from destruction from edges of the road, and the rotating one orbits the car and destroys enemies on contact. And finally, there's the bomb that instantly clears the screen of all enemies. Graphics-wise, Highway Fighter looks excellent, the backgrounds and sprites are all very colorful, smoothly animated and very varied, keeping the gameplay fresh looking all throughout. All that said, Highway Fighter is very demanding. It's so difficult in fact that only the most agile keyboard ninjas and WSAD assassins will be able to get anywhere in it. It's also probably why the game was then re-released in the West as Highway Hunter, polishing bits and pieces here and there and considerably lowering the difficulty. Either way, the original is still fun, just may take much more sweat and tears to complete. Completely impossible for me to pronounce Gildong-Jeon is essentially a tale of Korean Robin Hood, told via top-down turn-based JRPG gameplay. It's based on the classic Korean novel of the same title, in which the titular character is a child rejected by his family and eventually grows up to become the bandit that steals from the rich and gives to the poor. So yeah, your run-of-the-mill Robin Hood. On a side note, I wonder how many different cultures had the legend of such a good-hearted thief. We had Janosik here, he just did not live in the forest but in the mountains. Other than that, the very same dude. Honk, I can't pronounce the name correctly, Dong, is the very first color Korean RPG for DOS that released in the 90s. Why is it worth mentioning? Well, there weren't that many. It plays for the most part like early Dragon Quest games, so focuses a lot on exploration and random turn-based battles with a single character as a protagonist. The character growth and level system is rather simple, and it's probably for the best given the overall simplicity of gameplay and no extra party members. Most larger locations have a very maze-like design to them and will see you not only fighting enemies, but also seeking where to use quest-related items to push the plot further. It's also one of the bigger annoyances that very often to move ahead with the story you'll need to find and use appropriate item in appropriate spot, and they're rarely obvious. Even worse, you can permanently throw away any of the items in your inventory, which is a really bad game design in a title in which nearly all items apart from weapons and armor are quest-related. But whatever, it is what it is. And while the Hong Kong Bong sold nearly 7,000 copies throughout its lifespan, which was not bad for a Korean title, it only ever released in Japanese, Korean and Chinese. So it goes without saying that I've never played it, as sadly I don't speak either of the languages. Despite the previous game telling a story of a Korean Robin Hood and this one being developed by Sherwood Forest Software, I assure you that this is all just a mere coincidence, and it's not a Sherwood Bandit themed episode. Also, High Seas Homicide is a game that single-handedly puts this entire video at risk of demonetization. Some words are just best unsaid on YouTube, and it seems I constantly ignore it. Look at me, being a rebel and all. Anyway, High Seas is a text parser-driven shower detective adventure. It takes place aboard of a cruise ship HMS Elias, on which you're on vacation. You're a Scotland Yard detective, one Martin T. Beringer, who upon hearing 3 gunshots coming from the vague location of a ballroom area, leaves his cabin to investigate. Majority of gameplay will see you walking around the ship, conversing with people on board, trying to figure out who was shot and, more importantly, who is the killer. As you talk to more and more passengers and crew, you'll slowly start figuring out, based on all the clues, who the potential suspect is. If you identify him correctly, you'll get a reward. But beware, as false accusation will see you being abandoned in the middle of the ocean in a lifeboat. While High Seas sports despised by me text parser mechanics, and I really hate those with a passion of a 7,000 retired adult industry actors, it also features a very basic EGA graphics. Usually I would have considered them fugly at best, but given that most you do will see you typing in letters in a manic fashion, any graphics are a nice touch here. If you like parser adventures, you'll definitely enjoy this one too, even if it's not as complicated as some others can be. But if you don't, then avoid it. It's not one to sway you. Imperium Rex is a multiplayer futuristic turn-based top-down strategy wargame that's very similar but not identical to a more well-known Empire. It's been built from ground up as a multiplayer game in which 3 of you can battle it out for a global domination, and play on one of the several included maps or even create your own. The main goal is to build an expansive empire by conquering all the opponents and neutral cities. Each player starts with just one city and a few basic units and needs to magic their way to the riches, huge army and even bigger empire. So you'll start by exploring the world, finding and securing basic resources and expanding your sphere of influence and reach. Then, with progress, you'll focus more on researching new technologies, trading on a global market, building your armies up for both defense and conquering, and erecting support infrastructure. If all that sounds like fun, then good, cause it is, but only in multiplayer, as single-player games are incredibly limited and only ever allow for a practice mode with no opponents and only neutral cities available. They are not defenseless, but don't expand or attack the player. So yeah, you're right, it's a pointless exercise that's anything but fun. Many of the technologies and units, such as photon cannons or laser tanks, are clearly futuristic, fitting well within the overarching theme of the game. Interestingly enough, the entire Imperium Rex's graphics are presented in text mode using custom ASCII set, making for a novel-looking game. Now, let me be clear, Imperium Rex, even in multiplayer, is not the best strategy game you may spend your time at, but it's good enough for you and a couple of your friends to have fun for an evening or two, creating custom maps and then battling it out on them while having drinks. In the Dead of Night is a rather fun sharer point-and-click adventure game that could have easily had a full-fledged traditional commercial release if it was a bit well-paced. To simplify it to the most basic, it's a detective mystery story. You're Tom's cool, and you're cool. Well, he may not be, but you definitely are. And you're a PI hired by a jewel collector of questionable morality. He hires Tom to sneak into famous actress's chalet, posing as the double of a well-known thriller writer, Eric Wells, and steal her precious gem named Vesnu. Now, believe it or not, but Tom is stupid enough to accept. And I know that if he hadn't, we wouldn't have a game to play, but come on. Would you really risk your entire career on stealing something? Whatever, people are in different places in their lives, and perhaps this was the time and place for Tom to do something like that. We will never know. As you're in the process of fulfilling your super secret mission of theft and deceit, the snowstorm breaks out and the actress who's a gem owner is mysteriously killed by one of her guests. Does it sound familiar to you? Haven't we just spoke about a similar scenario? Well, whatever. Since the police can't arrive until the weather clears up, you take it upon yourself to put your PI skills to the test and solve the case all by yourself. So, you'll be questioning all the guests present in the late actress's house, seeking any and all evidence of murder. I really gotta be more careful with my words. And you'll also be collecting items which may then be used in figuring out who the culprit was. The characters are rather well written and somewhat believable, the plot is fun and engaging, and the puzzles are just right. Not too easy and not too demanding. And the only problem that the game has is the aforementioned pacing, because you may very well be in the middle of questioning a group of people one by one, trying to find anything, the tiniest of strings to pull on, not knowing if you're getting any closer and having nothing to build your case on, and then 5 minutes later suddenly have most of the case, or at least a solid chunk of it, all entirely figured out. The game leans more on the detective side rather than mysteries, is what I mean here. The presentation is decent, though nothing unseen in similar games, and overall, In the Dead of Night is a fun little game to waste some time on. So, if you like point and clickers, don't skip it. Insane Speedway is an obscure Polish speedway manager that simulates both Polish speedway leagues, Championship and First League. And I'm gonna be honest here with you, I know nothing about the sport in real life, and care even less to learn. So my whole experience with it is through this game years ago. Insane Speedway is surprisingly comprehensive and yet not overflowing with options. So after an hour or so, you'll be completely familiar with what it has to offer. And the only real issue that I can find with it is that it only ever released in Polish. So the language and focus on Speedway as the sport of choice are the reasons for its obscurity. So even if you're never going to play it, let me quickly tell you what it's all about. In Insane Speedway, you're responsible for any and all tasks around your chosen club. You will manage its finances, deal with advertising and sponsorships, manage riders' training and salaries, and you'll also be responsible for purchases, sales, maintenance and repairs of motorcycles. Everything that there is required to run a speedway club is what you'll be dealing with on a daily basis, is what I'm saying here. You can even attempt to buy or sell a game, bribe the opposing technical teams or hire an undercover informant. So play the metagame, searching for real-life exploits. Insane Speedway is quite deep for a small game as it is. Oh, and the best thing about it is that you can play it in hot seat multiplayer with up to 5 friends of yours. If all of you read Polish, that is. Anyway, the matches are presented in a top-down view with players represented as helmets racing all over the stadium track. Insane Speedway may not be as overwhelming with options and features as some of those more well-known football managers are, but it also tackles a bit easier to deal with sport, so you can't really complain about it. It's a really decent title that was DOA by releasing in one language only, not to mention covering a very niche sport. In Pursuit of Greed is aptly named 1996 genre sci-fi first-person shooter. Why am I so mean to it despite barely mentioning anything about it? Well, it looks as if it was made only in Pursuit of Greed. To ride the wave of the FPS craze and cashing big on ignorance and obliviousness of players wanting more and more games in the genre and not having bothered to check the reviews of them beforehand. I mean, if I was to purchase In Pursuit of Greed at full price, I'd be seriously disappointed. Pissed even. It somehow manages to look worse than 3 years older Doom, play considerably less fun too, and feature a selection of enemies and weapons that not only feels generic and uninspired, but also boring to use. I mean, do you remember how fun it was in Doom to get a shotgun? Or a chainsaw? Or even a BFG? Not here. All weapons just pew pew pew, and while they look different, they don't really get that "oh shit, that's so cool" moment at any point. There are 5 different characters that you can play as, but in reality they're just 5 different skins that you neither really get to see while playing, nor they feel noticeably different. And the only semi-novel thing about the game really are the randomly generated weapons and ammo. They're not pre-baked into the levels as particular ones, and you never know what you'll get. And it can lead to you being either heavily over or underpowered and the game feeling uneven. It may have been a leftover from a multiplayer design, but I've no way of confirming or denying that today. Correction, I don't really care enough about it to dig deeper. Somehow we've finally got here where I have to mention how it runs. Well, I don't have to anything, but it's worth a word or two. Quake that looked 77,140 times better than our today's shooter does, ran way better on then current hardware than In Pursuit of Greed did. And sure, the game will run fine today through those bugs, cause we can throw at it practically infinite by 1990 standards horsepower, but playing it using original era appropriate hardware will be a test of patience, as frame rates like to stick to the very low double digits, most often starting with 1. Believe it or not, but In Pursuit of Greed has a story. It's really bad, takes place in the year 15,432, yep, that's when it happens, and you're working as a mercenary for those who pay the most. That's more or less the gist of it. I won't get into more detail, cause I hope that you won't waste your time trying to play this game. It's not worth it. I should really stop dumping on it already, I'm nearly empty anyway. So, there is one thing that's worth praising about it, and it's the soundtrack design, which is just fantastic. And how such an amazing collection of tunes ended up in the potato of a shooter will forever remain a mystery unsolved. I won't recommend playing In Pursuit of Greed to anyone, but if you like 90s video game music, then track it down anyway, just to listen to the songs. In Search of Dr. Riptide is a very fun and unusual sharer side-view shooter. You play as Nick Nautilus, Marine Agent 1138, a tactical mini-sub-pilot, and you're summoned to locate and stop evil scientist Dr. Tiberius Riptide, who's hiding in his super-secret underwater laboratory and plotting a gross misuse of natural sea resources. What a villain! He's not after the world, peace, or any nation in particular, he's out there to get the fish. The game is divided into 3 chapters, split into 23 individual levels, and features 3 large end chapter bosses, one of them being Riptide himself. The enemies are rather varied and interestingly designed and very aggressive, usually going for you as soon as they appear. In fact, the game is incredibly demanding and will require a lot from you to complete. Having to keep an eye on your shield and air meter is another factor to add to the challenge of avoiding a constant onslaught of bodies. Fortunately, you're not defenseless, and you can pick up a slew of various power-ups and weapons, but even the strongest ones won't be much help in narrow corridors in which you may get promptly jumped by hungry hippos. I mean hungry sharks, or piranhas even. So going through Riptide will be a test of both your shooter skills and ability to use Jason. Yeah, Jason. I've not mentioned it before, and it's your best friend in this fiendishly tough game. It's a small submersible manless remote-controlled craft that you can send ahead to scout for dangers. Jason's HP is not connected to yours in any way, so if he dies while scouting, you're not getting harmed. And trust me, the sooner you get used to using it, the better you'll do in the long run. The levels are big and rather nicely designed, and the graphics are quite decent too. Sound design, however, is not great. I mean, it's nothing that should detract from playing, but it's definitely not complementing this otherwise stellar package. In the end, if you like shooters, especially those older 8-bit cavern-based ones, In Search of Dr. Riptide is very similar to them, but lifted to the modern at the time gameplay and presentation standards. And while it's really demanding, I cannot not recommend it, it's just too good to be ignored anymore, especially that the history already managed to do it once. In Extremis is a sci-fi horror-themed FPS. It is composed out of 29 levels and sees you playing as a space pilot stranded aboard a derelict vessel deep in space seeking to escape it. To leave, you must find and collect keycards, and there's 2 kinds of these. First is used to open lockers containing weapons and equipment, which you can't survive without. And second, open elevators, allowing you to progress to the further stages. In fact, In Extremis feels like a budget version of Aliens the movie, as the ship that you're on is filled to the brim with dead bodies in various stages of mutilation, rotting away, often dismembered. Also, countless hordes of sneaky and deadly aliens who are responsible for said bodies. So, naturally, you have to plow your way through them like an indestructible space badass that you are, pushing forward and forward to the end. Theirs or yours. Other than the extraterrestrial flesh munchers, there are air and batteries that you have to keep in constant check. So refill your oxygen tanks whenever you get a chance, as otherwise, well, you can imagine what happens in space when you've nothing to breathe with, and batteries are used for both, motion tracker and night vision. These 2 drain the batteries like crazy, like a teen draining his first ever bottle of whiskey, not knowing what's waiting for him on the other end of it the next morning, and it's usually regret, pre-broken promises of never doing it again, and pain everywhere. Possibly some sweet one-on-one with a toilet and a day prior's dinner too. You never know until it happens. Some levels feature hatching nests that spawn aliens in a constant uninterrupted stream of death and destruction, and these can be destroyed only with the use of bombs. So it's best to always have at least one, just in case. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, or however else that saying went. Anyway, from a technical point of view, In Extremis is closer to Wolfenstein than Doom. It's running on a very simple texture mapped raycasting engine, all the walls and corridors are limited to 90-degree angles only, and the levels are very flat and maze-like in their design. That said, texture work, enemy and weapon details are a definite step up over Wolfenstein. So, in reality, it's somewhere in the middle between the two classics. Sound design is pretty good too, with clear not distorted samples well fitting to the situation on the screen, and all weapons sounding the way you'd hope that they would. Bottom line is, In Extremis is not a bad game. It's just incredibly average at what it is, and was eclipsed by better and more well-known giants of the genre when it released, forever remaining in the gloomy shadows of obscurity. So, what do you think of today's games? Hopefully you didn't know any of them, and maybe even one or two are something you'd like to try. Perhaps because they look fun, or the opposite, because they're so bad that you just can't not check them out. Either way, let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. Smash them if you have to, it helps more than you could ever know. Also, I would like to thank you and all my amazing Patreon and YouTube members for helping this channel keep going. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank all the wonderful folks who record and upload playthroughs, let's plays and other retro-centric videos here on YouTube, because they help to preserve the games that would have otherwise been long forgotten. So thank you.